So, for example, if I were to take an individual and people have done these studies, not we, but where you limit them to, let's say, 4 or 5 hours of sleep for 1 week, your levels of blood sugar are disrupted so significantly that your doctor at the end of that 1 week would classify you as being pre-diabetic. So that's, you could almost argue that's short term, not mid-term.
Yeah.
Um, one, if you're a male and I limit you to 4 or 5 hours of sleep, healthy young male, for 1 week, I will drop your levels of testosterone to that of someone who is 10 years older than you. So I can age you by a decade just by short sleeping you for 1 week. We see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health, in estrogen, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. So it's both men and women. Your blood pressure will start to creep up. Your systolic blood pressure, in particular, will creep up. Your heart rate, in terms of its contraction rate, in other words, the speed of your heart, starts to increase. The progression into obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, suicidality, all of these things, immune compromise, infection, all of those things can be termed, will be midterm. Now, all of those things have a longer term tail to them, which is this thing called premature mortality. So, using that sweet spot of 7 to 9 hours of sleep, you can argue that there's a simple truth on the basis of the data. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep will predict all cause mortality.
Is that supported by data?
That's supported by data. Yeah. Now, there's an interesting change there, which is once you get past about 9 or 10 hours, your mortality risk doesn't just keep going down and down. It will hook back up again, as if almost too much sleep is a bad thing. And we can explain why that is the case as well, and why it's probably not quite as simple as that. But the final long term consequence that I would say is Alzheimer's disease. The two most feared diseases in developed nations are cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Both of them have links to insufficient sleep, many of them causal. And this relationship between sleep and Alzheimer's disease, this is where we actually do, I'd probably say almost 50% of the work that I do at my sleep center is focused on sleep and Alzheimer's disease. And there, the data is stunning. I would say at this stage, insufficient sleep seems to be one of the one of the most significant lifestyle factors that can develop or dictate the development of Alzheimer's disease later in life. Now, that's a lifestyle factor. There are other genetic factors, but certainly we now know that it's not just that insufficient sleep predicts a greater amount of Alzheimer's pathology in your brain. So, for example, people who on average are sleeping 6 hours or less have a far higher magnitude of amyloid, of beta amyloid, which is the sticky toxic protein related to Alzheimer's disease, and another protein called tau protein. These are the two protein culprits of Alzheimer's. Both of those are escalate the less and less sleep that you have. Now, that's just associational. We also know, by the way, that two sleep disorders, insomnia and sleep apnea, heavy snoring, both of those are associated with a marked increased risk of your Alzheimer's disease later in life. That's simply associational. That doesn't prove causality, but we now have the causal evidence, both in animal models and in human models. If I deprive a human being of sleep for a single night, or I even just deprive you of deep sleep for a single night, the next day we can see an immediate increase in these Alzheimer's disease related proteins circulating in your bloodstream, circulating in what we call a cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain. And using special brain scans, we can even measure it within the brain itself. So these are causal manipulations. It's not associational. I manipulate this thing called sleep, and the consequence is that I manipulate your Alzheimer's disease proteins. That's correlation going to causation. Then the question is, well, mechanism. What is it about sleep when you get it that is de-escalating Alzheimer's disease risk? In other words, when you don't get it, why would it increase your Alzheimer's risk? And this was a stunning discovery made by a scientist called Macon Nedergaard at the University of Rochester here in America. And she found three things. First, studying mice and rats, she found that the brain has a cleansing system. Now, we didn't used to think that your brain had a cleansing system. Your body had one, and everyone knows what it's called. It's called the lymphatic system. We didn't think the brain had one, but she discovered that the brain has one. It's called the glymphatic system. named after these glial cells that make it up. The second thing that she discovered is that that cleansing system within the brain is not always switched on in high flow volume across the 24-hour period. It was expressly during sleep, and particularly during deep non-REM sleep, when that sort of sewage system was put into overdrive and washed away all of this detritus that built up during the day. And the final thing that she discovered, and this is why it's related to Alzheimer's disease, is that two of the metabolic byproducts that build up during the day in our brain are beta amyloid and tau protein, the two bad actors in Alzheimer's disease. So in other words, what she discovered is a system of, good night, sleep clean. That sleep is a power cleanse for the brain. And if you're not getting your sleep every night, it doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease next week. It doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, in a year's time. But night after night, once again, it's like compounding interest on a loan. And that's why we now believe through this causal mechanism that insufficient sleep is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Lots of people will say to me, look, there are these individuals in society who claim that they, didn't need very much sleep, who didn't sleep a lot. Margaret Thatcher is often quoted to me about that. Ronald Reagan was apparently another short sleeper. I don't think it's coincidental that both Thatcher and Reagan went on to die of the unfortunate disease of Alzheimer's.